Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Great to be back.
So for this one, we're heading over to the Horn of Africa. We're digging into a place that's, well, it's been doing its own thing for over 30 years now, Somaliland.
That's right. It's this territory that declared independence from Somalia way back in 91. But, and this is the key thing, it hasn't actually received formal international recognition from, well, pretty much anyone.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like a state in practice, running itself, but not really on paper, in the eyes of the world.
A de facto state.
And you hear about it quite a bit, actually. It often gets painted as this kind of remarkable success story.
Yeah, this beacon of stability, democracy, especially in a really tough neighborhood. The recent presidential election really amplified that narrative.
But like always on the deep dive, when you really look closer, go beyond those headlines, the reality. Well, it's a lot more complicated, isn't it always? It absolutely is. And for this deep dive, you've shared quite a range of sources with us. We've got recent articles from places like The Conversation, The Guardian. They tend to lean into that positive story.
Right.
But we've also got these more critical analyses, a reality report, a synthesis document, pieces that really try to, unpack what's actually happening beneath that surface narrative.
Okay, so that's our mission today. We want to get beyond the simple story, help you understand the complex politics, the geopolitics at play, and we're going to focus specifically on, well, three things the critical sources really hammer home.
Which are?
First, this deep-seated influence of tribalism or clanism. Second, its pretty significant dependency on foreign powers. And third, this gap, often quite wide, between the public story and the reality on the ground.
Okay, sounds good. Because Somaliland has definitely achieved some things since 1991. We should say that up front.
No doubt. Just this past November, they held their fourth presidential election. One person, one vote.
And it marked a peaceful transfer of power. The opposition Wadani party won, taking over after, 14 years of the Komi party being in charge.
Yeah, 14 years. And that election, it was a big deal. The Wadani leader, Abdurrahman Mohammed Abdullahi, people often call him Siro or Iro, he won pretty decisively, got about 64% of the vote.
Right. And it happened, importantly, after a 2-year delay. There were, financial issues, technical challenges cited. But it did go ahead eventually.
And that whole event, the election, the peaceful transfer, it really fueled a lot of the recent media coverage, much of which, as you said, fits into this, let's call it optimistic narrative.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so let's unpack that narrative a bit more. What is that optimistic view, the one you see in The Conversation or The Guardian? What does it tend to focus on?
Well, the main thing is what they frame as Somaliland's democratic resilience.
Right.
The very fact they hold these regular elections, that the outgoing president conceded peacefully, the smooth handover to the opposition.
Right.
All that is presented as proof that Somaliland has built these solid, working democratic institutions. And that really stands out compared to many of its neighbors.
And that resilience story is directly tied to their big goal. International recognition. The narrative is that the new Wadani government is really pushing for this, building on what the previous guys did.
Exactly. They point to things like Somaliland setting up representative offices in some Western countries. The former President Bihi even made an unofficial trip to Washington. You had UK parliamentary delegations visiting, all presented as steps towards that ultimate goal of recognition. And the sources emphasize, the vast majority of people in Somaliland want independence.
So the stability angle is really key here then. It's constantly pushed as this beacon of relative peace in a really volatile Horn of Africa. You compare it to the instability in Somalia proper or authoritarian regimes nearby.
Yeah, the narrative definitely positions Somaliland as this potential force for stability in the whole region.
And that flows right into the next point, the strategic ally idea.
Absolutely. Because of where it is right there on the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, it's super relevant for regional security, for counterterrorism stuff, and obviously for protecting those huge global trade routes that go right past its coast.
Yeah, and this is where the geopolitics gets really interesting. The sources mention some buzz, some speculation about increased U.S. interest. There was that point from Project 2025 suggesting recognizing Somaliland could be a kind of a hedge against the U.S.'s deteriorating position in Djibouti, which is where the U.S. has its big base.
Yeah, that's a potentially significant angle. And you see other little indicators cited, too. Reports of U.S. military folks visiting Hargeisa, the capital. Talk about sending a U.S. team to evaluate the asset, meaning the port at Berbera. There were even mentions of U.S. carriers operating off the coast, involved in the Yemen bombing raids.
And the incoming president, Abdullahi, is quoted sort of leaning into this, saying things like, we're a partner in security, a partner in counterterrorism, a partner in safe marine routes, basically positioning Somaliland as ready to help.
And there are other bits that support this optimistic view, too. Like Gavin Williamson, the former UK Defense Secretary, he's mentioned as pushing hard for recognition in the UK Parliament.
Okay.
You get these little snippets, reports of some U.S. officials giving assurances like recognition is getting there, or Basha Omar, who used to represent Somaliland, reportedly talking about frustration in some U.S. circles with the old one Somalia policy.
And you can't ignore the money, the commercial side?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
The UAE's DP World poured a huge amount, like $442 million, into the Berbera port. That's transformed it.
Huge investment.
Yeah. And then there's that controversial deal with Ethiopia, the Port for Recognition MOU signed by the last administration.
Right. That caused a stir.
It did. And interestingly, the sources mentioned the new Wadani leaders seemed a bit unsure about the details of that deal, which maybe tells you something about, transparency or how solid these things are even internally.
That's a good point. One more detail that popped up, though it sounds pretty speculative, this idea about potentially resettling Palestinians from Gaza.
Yeah, that surfaced.
Yeah.
The reports quote Somaliland officials saying, they welcome refugees, they're hospitable people. Apparently there are about 12 Palestinian families there already.
Okay.
But they're careful to say there haven't been any official talks with the U.S. or Palestinians about some kind of large-scale resettlement. It seems more like a side comment that got picked up.
Got it. So, okay, if you put all that together, the elections, the stability claims, the strategic location talk, the foreign the investment, the picture you get from a lot of the media is, yeah, a functioning democracy, a reliable partner, a state on the rise. Sounds pretty positive, especially for that region.
It certainly paints an encouraging picture.
Yeah.
And here's the deep dive part. While those elements exist, they're real achievements in some ways. The critical analysis we looked at from the reality report and the synthesis, it offers a much, much more complex view.
Yeah.
Maybe a more sobering one.
Yeah, this is where we try to get underneath that narrative.
Exactly. What's fascinating is how this critical analysis really pushes back against that seemingly straightforward success story.
Okay, so it raises a big question then. How deep does that democracy actually go when you look at how power really works there?
Precisely the question. The critical synthesis acknowledges, yes, there are functioning institutions, they hold elections, but it calls this, partly at least, a democratic facade.
Facade, okay.
Because the core argument is that democracy in Somaliland isn't just about individual votes. It's deeply, profoundly tangled up with clan-based power sharing. The whole political system, fundamentally, is structured around clan identity, negotiations between clan elders.
And the Gertie is the big example of this, right? The House of Elders. The critical sources really focus on this.
Yes, absolutely. The Gertie is described as this unelected, entirely clan-based body that holds enormous power. I mean, think about it. This unelected group can extend the president's term, and they have, multiple times, basically messing with the election schedule.
Wow. Okay.
They have veto power over laws passed by the elected parliament. They act as the final authority on loads of critical issues, mediating big disputes. That structure really challenges the idea of a purely representative democracy based on elections alone.
And this clan structure isn't just theoretical, is it? The critical sources say it leads to power being concentrated.
It does, very much so.
Yeah.
Power is heavily weighted towards the dominant Isaac clan. They tend to control the presidency, key cabinet posts, the security forces. The analysis argues that, especially under the previous Kulmi government, this was widely seen, both inside and outside Somaliland, as favoring the Isaac.
Which naturally would lead to other groups feeling left out, marginalized.
Exactly. The critical sources detail how non-Isaac groups, especially the Dolbahante and Warsangali clans in the eastern Sul and Sanag regions, feel systematically marginalized. They have historically resisted Hargeisa's control. And the argument gets pretty pointed here. Some sources essentially say, yes, Somaliland might look democratic in Hargeisa in the west, but for many people in the east, it functions more like an Isaac ethnocracy. Power based on clan, not equal representation.
And the conflict in Las Anad, in the Sul region, that's presented as the starkest proof of this critical view.
It really is. The Las Anad conflict is this ongoing insurgency explicitly rooted in these clan issues and territory disputes. You have local Dulbahante forces fighting against control from Hargeisa, and the human cost is huge. Hundreds killed, over 200,000 people forced from their homes.
That completely contradicts the beacon of peace narrative.
It absolutely does. It shows instability isn't just absent, it's violent and ongoing in parts of the territory Somaliland claims. And the sources mentioned really disturbing reports. Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders talking about attacks on hospitals, indiscriminate shelling by Somaliland's army. MSF actually pulls out because of it.
Gosh. So the conclusion from these critical sources is that Somaliland is what? A hybrid. Democratic on the surface, but tribal underneath.
That's pretty much it. A hybrid polity. It has the form of democracy elections, parliament, but the substance of governance, how power is actually shared and used, remains deeply tribal. And the stability it does have is selective. It's mainly in the Isaac areas, and in the east it seems maintained by force, not really by popular consent.
Okay, that's a really crucial distinction. And this critical lens also applies to the idea of Somaliland being self-reliant, its diplomatic position.
Yes, the sources really challenge that notion. They argue its survival as a de facto state isn't just down to its own efforts or legitimacy. It hinges heavily on external interests, foreign powers needing or wanting something from Somaliland.
So less independent state, more an entity propped up by outside forces, geopolitically engineered almost.
That's the framing. The analysis details these dependencies. Look at Ethiopia. They desperately need sea access. They call it an existential issue. They rely massively on the Berbera port for trade. That accounts for most of the port's business and brings in vital customs revenue for Somaliland. And that recent Port for Recognition MOU, even if the details are murky, it just cements that deep economic and potentially military interdependence.
And it's not just Ethiopia. The UK, the EU, they're involved too.
Big time. They provide a lot of development aid. The sources mention specific figures: $2.5 million for elections, support for security sector reform, training, equipment. The UK was also part of that huge $232 million Berbera port investment with DP World.
Okay.
Plus you have commercial things like Genel Energy looking for oil. So while it's often presented as support for democracy or stability, it also creates significant dependency and gives these external actors leverage.
And the UAE with DP World is obviously a massive player.
Huge. That $442 million investment isn't just about port fees, it's strategic. It's about the UAE expanding commercially, securing its position in that vital Gulf of Aden Red Sea area, maybe pushing back against rivals. And they're involved in security too, like training the Somaliland Coast Guard.
The critical sources use this phrase, creating facts on the ground. What does that mean here with all this foreign support?
It means that by providing all this ongoing practical support money, security training, diplomatic engagement, even without formal recognition, these foreign powers are, maybe without explicitly intending to, building up Somaliland's capacity as a separate thing. It makes the idea of Somaliland ever going back to Somalia seem less and less likely, whatever the official policies say. The external help reinforces the separation, the de facto reality.
So the argument then is, if recognition ever happens, it might not really be about Somaliland earning it through good governance, but more about it being useful to other countries, a bargaining chip.
That's the core argument in the critical analysis, Recognition becomes less about Somaliland's right to self-determination and more about meeting the strategic goals of others. Ethiopia needing the port, the UK's post-colonial links or business interests, the UAE's ambitions. They basically conclude Somaliland functions as a geopolitically subsidized entity. Its existence is precarious, really dependent on these outside backers. And crucially, these foreign powers are seen as putting their own interests first, which might actually end up prolonging the fragmentation of the wider Somali region.
Wow, okay. That is a very different picture from the simple success story. So finally, let's revisit that stability narrative directly. The critical analysis does acknowledge some real achievements, right?
It does, It doesn't dismiss everything. They recognize Somaliland has achieved a degree of stability, especially in the western Isaac majority areas. They mention the peaceful power transfers, the government institutions that do function, the economic development you see in Hargeisa and Berbera, and their relative success in keeping groups like Al-Shabaab mostly contained.
The big but is that the stability isn't uniform. It doesn't cover the whole territory they claim.
Absolutely not. They keep coming back to Las Anod. That conflict is the undeniable proof that stability is uneven. It's selectively enforced. You can't talk about a beacon of peace when hundreds are dead and hundreds of thousands are displaced due to conflict within its claimed borders. That tells a story of deep instability.
And they also suggest that even where there is stability, it's not just because everyone agrees. There are other factors.
Yes, the critical analysis raises concerns about, well, suppressing dissent. They talk about journalists being detained, restrictions placed on opposition groups, especially outside election time, limits on free speech, particularly if you start questioning independence or suggest reunification or criticize how the government handles the eastern regions. You can apparently face legal trouble for saying the wrong thing.
So stability partly maintained by control, not just consensus.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
It suggests stability relies, at least in part, on managing the narrative and limiting opposition voices, not just on broad popular support everywhere.
And this links back to the marginalization of places like Seoul and Sanok. It's not just conflict, it's a lack of real political voice, fewer services, and those areas are often described as being under military occupation rather than governed with local consent.
Exactly. That's the heart of the critique on stability. So the conclusion is that this stability narrative, it's got some truth to it for certain places and certain times, but it also functions as a tool.
A tool for who?
Well, it serves the Somaliland government politically. It helps legitimize their claim to be a state, and it's absolutely vital for attracting the foreign investment and aid they need.
Okay.
And it also serves the foreign actors.
Mm-hmm.
It gives them a justification for engaging, for pursuing their commercial interests, and maybe it helps mask deeper geopolitical motives behind this idea of supporting democracy and peace.
So the stability story is a mix, part truth, part myth, selectively applied. It hides the conflict, the suppression, the marginalization elsewhere. Its usefulness is more political, more strategic, than just being an accurate description of the whole place.
Precisely. It's a narrative constructed, in part, to appeal to the outside world, to potential partners.
Okay, let's try and tie these threads together then. How do these three big themes, the deep clanism, the reliance on foreign powers, and this gap between the narrative and the reality, how do they all interact? How do they shape Somaliland?
They're completely tangled up. It creates this really complex, maybe quite fragile situation. The entrenched clanism, especially the power concentration with the Isaac and the feeling of marginalization among other groups, that's the core internal problem. It creates divisions, it fuels conflict like we see so clearly in Las Ana.
Right, and that internal conflict, that instability, directly undermines the shiny stability narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is the very narrative Somaliland needs to project to get the foreign support and investment that arguably its very existence depends on right now.
But then that foreign support, even though it's essential for keeping the economy going and maintaining security forces, it's mainly driven by what those countries want.
Right, and that creates this dependency cycle. Foreign help lets Somaliland function separately, which reinforces its separation from Somalia, maybe makes reunification even harder down the line. But this reliance also makes Somaliland's position quite shaky, dependent on the shifting moods and priorities of its backers. It arguably undermines its own claims to be truly self-reliant or sovereign. It becomes, like that source said, geopolitically subsidized.
It sounds like a real catch-22. The internal clan structure causes problems that need foreign help, but the foreign help locks it into this dependent status, reliant on outside agendas, not just its own internal strength.
It's a constant balancing act, isn't it, between these internal clan politics and these external geopolitical pressures.
So why does understanding all this complexity matter for you listening right now?
Well, because I think it helps you see the world a bit more clearly. It gives you insight into the challenges that other de facto states, other places seeking recognition, might face. It's a really powerful case study in how foreign policy, even things that look like positive aid or investment, can have really deep, sometimes unexpected effects on how places are governed, especially in volatile regions.
Yeah.
And it just trains your eye, doesn't it, to look past the easy headlines, the simplified stories, and see the much more complicated, often contradictory reality that's usually going on underneath.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that headlines rarely capture the full picture. Somaliland has achieved some remarkable things since '91, building institutions, holding elections, keeping the peace in large parts of its territory. That's undeniable. But those achievements exist alongside these really deep structural challenges rooted in its clan system and this critical dependence on outside actors whose main motivations are, let's be honest, probably their own strategic and economic goals.
So the path forward for Somaliland, it's anything but clear. It really hangs on whether the new government can manage those internal clan tensions, build genuine inclusion across the whole territory, and also on how the whole geopolitical chessboard shifts, and whether foreign powers stay interested and what they want in return.
It leaves you with a pretty interesting thought to chew on, doesn't it? When you see the next headline about Somaliland, will this place eventually get formal recognition because it convinces the world based on its own merits becoming a truly functional, inclusive state?
Or Will its fate ultimately be decided more by the strategic calculations and rivalries of bigger players, countries looking for partners, for ports, for influence in a critical part of the world?
What does this whole story tell us about self-determination in today's messy, interconnected world? Something to mull over.